Almost all of Egypt's fresh water arrives in one river, and Egypt doesn't control it. Since September, the river has arrived through another country's dam, the largest power plant in Africa. Egypt objected for 14 years while it went up anyway. Ethiopia paid for it with its own citizens' money, defended it with missiles, and switched it on. The site was marked by American engineers 60 years ago in a report that sat on a shelf until Ethiopia took it down. This story begins in 1902 with an empire and a signature. The Blue Nile runs out of the Ethiopian highlands into a lowland province called Benishangul Gumuz. It's February 2026, and just before the river crosses into Sudan, it flows through the largest power plant in Africa. It's called the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. The dam rises nearly 500 feet. From bank to bank, it stretches more than a mile. Ethiopia says all 13 of its turbines are spinning. Nobody outside Ethiopia has checked that claim. The scale isn't in dispute, though. At full power, this one dam can make more than twice what Egypt's own Aswan High Dam can. Ethiopia's already selling the power. Even before the last turbines came online, the dam was making about a third of the country's electricity. The surplus goes abroad on new high-voltage lines. About $118 million of exports in the 2024-25 fiscal year, and rising fast since. Most of that went to Kenya, which signed a 25-year deal and plans to double what it takes. Djibouti and Sudan buy it too, and Tanzania is next in line. Inside Ethiopia, the case for the dam is simple. 6 in 10 Ethiopians still don't have electricity. The dam adds about as much power as everything else in the country combined. Ethiopia built it to fix that problem and sold it as a national cause. Millions of Ethiopians bought the bonds that paid for it. A week before the ribbon was cut, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed gave the lake behind the dam a name, Nigat. It means dawn. He said the name stands for the time we woke up and realized the wealth we have. He was talking about the water. Nigat stretches about 150 miles behind the dam. Right now it's holding some 64 billion cubic meters. Full, it takes 74 billion, close to everything the entire Nile carries in a year, parked in one lake. All of that water is headed for Egypt, more than 1,500 miles downstream. And most of the Nile now passes through Ethiopian turbines on the way. The Blue Nile carries over half the river's water in an average year and in flood season, nearly all of it. Egypt sits at the far end of those miles. About 9 in every 10 liters of Egypt's fresh water come from the river. More than 100 million people live along its banks and delta on roughly 3% of Egypt's land. The rest of the country is desert, which is why the river sits at the center of Egyptian politics, and always has. The math per person is tight and getting tighter. Hydrologists call a country water poor below 1,000 cubic meters per person per year. Egypt is at about 560, and the number falls a little every year because the population keeps growing and the river stays the same. By 2030, on current trends, Egypt crosses into what the UN calls absolute scarcity. So when the dam formally opened on September 9th, 2025, 4 presidents came to watch. They flew in from Kenya, Somalia, Djibouti, and South Sudan. Air Force jets passed over the site. Kenya's president, William Ruto, called it a bold affirmation of Africa's capacity to shape its own destiny. Egypt wasn't there. Egypt answered the same day, in writing. Foreign Minister Badr Abdelhadi sent a letter to the UN Security Council calling the dam illegal. It described an existential threat to the rights and interests of the 150 million citizens of the downstream countries. It demanded that Ethiopia stop acting alone on the river, and it said Egypt reserves the right to take all appropriate measures to defend its people. On a visit to Kenya in March, Abdelhadi said it shorter. Without water, there is no Egypt, no civilization, no pyramids. It's a matter of life and death. Egypt fought this dam for 14 years. It argued through American mediation, 2 Security Council hearings, and years of African Union rounds. It protested every one of the 5 times Ethiopia filled the lake. None of it produced a binding agreement. The dam got built, filled, and switched on. The water spins the turbines, drops back into the river, and reaches Egypt a few weeks later. In a normal year, the dam barely changes what arrives downstream. The argument is about the drought years. Egypt's claim to that water rests on treaties written a century ago, most of them by the British Empire, and Ethiopia never signed the ones that divided the water. On May 15, 1902, Emperor Menelik II of Ethiopia signed a treaty with Great Britain in Addis Ababa. It settled borders and trade, and it included one short article about water. In the English text, the emperor promised not to construct or allow to be constructed any work across the Blue Nile that would cut its flow, unless Britain and Sudan agreed first. One sentence, and it covered the river that carries most of the Nile's water. The treaty existed in two languages, and the Amharic version didn't match the English one. Ethiopia has argued ever since that it never ratified it. For the next century, Britain and Egypt cited the English text, and Ethiopia answered that it never agreed to any such thing. Britain was negotiating for Egypt. It occupied the country, controlled the Suez Canal, and its mills ran on Egyptian cotton, so it bargained for Egypt's water in treaty after treaty. In 1906, Britain, France, and Italy signed a deal splitting influence over Ethiopia, and it protected Egypt's claim to the Nile. Ethiopia rejected it. It didn't have the power to do more than that. In 1925, Britain and Italy signed notes that gave Egypt and Sudan first claim to the waters of Lake Tana, the source of the Blue Nile, inside Ethiopia. Ethiopia protested to the League of Nations. "We would never have suspected," its note said, "that the British government would come to an agreement with another government regarding our lake." In 1929, Britain signed the Nile Waters Agreement with Egypt. Britain signed for Sudan, which it controlled. The deal gave Egypt 48 billion cubic meters of water a year, and Sudan 4, and it reserved the whole dry season for Egypt, from January to July. The deal also gave Egypt the right to inspect the river in other countries and a veto over any project upstream that might touch its flow. In November 1958, General Ibrahim Aboud seized power in Sudan. Talks with Egypt over the river had been stuck for years. They moved fast after the coup. On November 8, 1959, in Cairo, Egypt and Sudan signed the agreement for the full utilization of the Nile waters. The name was literal. They measured the river at 84 billion cubic meters a year and split all of it. Egypt took 55.5 billion, Sudan took 18.5. Two countries had divided the whole river between them, and roughly 4/5 of its water rises in one country, Ethiopia. The deal gave Ethiopia nothing. It wasn't invited to Cairo, it wasn't mentioned in the text, and it never signed it. 2 months later, on January 9, 1960, Egypt's president Gamal Abdel Nasser broke ground on the Aswan High Dam. The deal had cleared the way. Sudan accepted that the new lake would drown the town of Wadi Halfa. Its bigger share of the river was part of the price. Ethiopia's answer never changed. Emperor Haile Selassie rejected the treaties, and the junta that overthrew him rejected them too. The republic that came after rejects them today, on the same ground every time. Ethiopia never agreed to any of them. The same deal wrote off 10 billion cubic meters a year to evaporation over Egypt's new lake, more than twice the share Sudan got in 1929. And that same year, American survey teams were at work in the Ethiopian Gorge, measuring the Blue Nile for dams. On July 19, 1956, the State Department put out a short statement. It said American money for the Aswan High Dam was not feasible in present circumstances. The offer had been on the table since the year before. Now the Eisenhower administration pulled it, in public. Egypt's president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, answered within a week. On July 26th, he nationalized the Suez Canal and said its tolls would pay for the dam. Britain, France, and Israel invaded Egypt over it that fall. The crisis passed. The dam still needed money. The Soviet Union stepped in with loans, around $425 million, on easy terms. Soviet engineers in Moscow designed the dam itself. 25,000 Egyptians built it. In May 1964, the Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, flew to Egypt to watch the Nile get diverted around the worksite. He called the dam the eighth wonder of the world. One country upstream, the United States, signed an agreement with Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia in 1957. Under it, the engineers who went to work on the Blue Nile came from the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, the agency that built the Hoover Dam. The fieldwork took about 6 years. The teams mapped the gorge, measured the river's flow season by season, studied the rock, and tracked the silt that the Blue Nile carries down from the highlands. Much of that country hadn't been surveyed at all. In 1964, the Interior Department published the results in Washington. 6 volumes titled Land and Water Resources of the Blue Nile Basin, Ethiopia. Inside, the report proposed 4 major dams on the Ethiopian Blue Nile. The engineers named them Karadobi, Mabil, and Mendaya. The 4th sat about 21 kilometers from the Sudan border. They named it Border. Half a century later, Ethiopia built the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam on that stretch of river. It stands on the site the Americans had marked for border, at nearly 7 times the storage the report proposed. The 4 dams together could hold 73 billion cubic meters. On paper, their power came to about 2.5 times the Aswan High dams. Then Ethiopia came apart. The emperor was deposed in 1974. Somalia invaded in 1977. And civil war ran for years after that. Nobody built anything on the Blue Nile. In 1978, Ethiopia's new ruler, Mengistu Haile Mariam, proposed dams on the Blue Nile. Egypt's president, Anwar Sadat, answered, "We are not going to wait to die of thirst in Egypt. We'll go to Ethiopia and die there." Nothing came of any of it, and the report went onto shelves in Washington and Addis Ababa. On March 30th, 2011, Ethiopia announced its dam on the Blue Nile. Egypt's president, Hosni Mubarak, had resigned 7 weeks earlier. Egypt was in no position to answer. On April 2, 2011, Ethiopia's Prime Minister, Meles Zenawi, laid a foundation stone near Guba in the lowlands of Benishangul Gumuz. The spot sat on the Blue Nile, a short drive from the Sudanese border. The government had made the project public just 3 days earlier, on March 30th. The next day, it signed the construction contract, $4.8 billion, no competitive bidding, to Italy's Salini Impregilo. Egypt, meanwhile, was consumed by its own revolution. The project's name kept changing those first weeks. Its internal name had been Project X, and it went public as the Millennium Dam. On April 15th, the Council of Ministers settled on the name it carries now, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. At the launch, Meles put it this way: "No matter how poor we are, the Ethiopian people will pay any sacrifice." A year earlier, 5 upstream countries had signed an agreement in Entebbe to share the Nile on new terms: Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, and Tanzania. Egypt and Sudan refused to sign it. In 2010, asked about Egyptian threats to invade, Meles said, "Nobody who has tried that has lived to tell the story." The hard part was money. Egypt had lobbied international lenders to stay away from Blue Nile projects, and it worked. The World Bank and the IMF wouldn't touch it. So Ethiopia turned to its own people. The government sold dam bonds to citizens at home and abroad, and urged civil servants to give 1 to 2 months' salary. Much of the diaspora refused. Many cited corruption, and many wouldn't fund a government they considered authoritarian. The money came in anyway. One lender did step in. China's Export-Import Bank put up $1 billion for the turbines and the electrical works. Meles branded the project's critics hydropower extremists. In June 2011, a journalist named Riyad Alimu was imprisoned after questioning the dam in print. The government promised first power within 44 months. The whole dam was supposed to be done by July 2017. It actually opened in September 2025, just over 8 years late. Egypt would fight the dam for the next 14 years. None of it stopped construction. On Monday, June 3, 2013, Egyptian politicians arrived at the presidential palace in Cairo to discuss the dam with President Mohamed Morsi. Someone had decided at the last minute to put the meeting on live television. Nobody told them. 6 days earlier, on May 28th, Ethiopia had finished diverting the Blue Nile around the dam site. Yunus Makyun, an Islamist party leader, suggested backing rebels inside Ethiopia. Use them as a bargaining chip, he said. And if everything else failed, he said, Egypt could play the final card, which is using the intelligence service to destroy the dam. The liberal politician Ayman Noor proposed spreading rumors that Egypt was acquiring refueling aircraft. This could yield results on the diplomatic track, he said. Another politician, Magdi Hussein, pushed back and called the military talk very dangerous. The next day, Morsi's aide Pakinam El-Sharkawi apologized. The meeting had been aired live due to the importance of the topic, she said. I forgot to inform the participants. Morsi's office added that Egypt would never surrender its right to Nile water, and that all options were being considered. A week later, on June 10th, Morsi gave his own warning at a conference about the Nile. If our share of Nile water decreases, our blood will be the alternative. He had 3 more weeks in office. On July 3, 2013, Egypt's army chief, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, removed Morsi from power and said so on television. El-Sisi took the presidency the next year, and the dam became his problem. The fight moved to paper. On March 23, 2015, El-Sisi signed a declaration of principles in Khartoum with Ethiopia's Prime Minister Haile Mariam Desalegn and Sudan's President Omar Hassan el-Bashir. It listed 10 principles for sharing the river. It had no way to enforce any of them. The U.S. Treasury brokered talks from late 2019, and by February 2020, a draft deal was on the table. Ethiopia skipped the final session, and Egypt initialed the deal alone. Treasury Secretary Stephen Mnuchin said, "Final testing and filling should not take place without an agreement." The U.S. paused around $130 million of aid to Ethiopia. And in October 2020, President Donald Trump said this in the Oval Office. They'll end up blowing up the dam. And I said it, and I say it loud and clear. They'll blow up that dam. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's office answered, Ethiopia will not cave in to aggressions of any kind. Ethiopia filled the reservoir anyway. The first filling came in July 2020. Done, Abiy said, without bothering and hurting anyone else. 4 more followed through October 2024. The fourth alone added nearly as much water as the first 3 combined. An African Union round in Kinshasa deadlocked in April 2021, and in June, the Arab League asked the UN Security Council to act. The council met on July 8th and didn't vote. Its September statement urged a binding deal within a reasonable time frame. It never came. The last round collapsed in Addis Ababa in December 2023. Egypt's water ministry declared the talks over. Ethiopia's foreign ministry answered that Egypt was still acting from what it reportedly called a colonial-era mentality. The reservoir finished filling in October 2024. 21 months after the talks collapsed, Ethiopia held its opening ceremony. A month after the ceremony, the river rose. In October and November 2025, heavy rain over the Ethiopian highlands pushed the Nile up, and floodwater moved into 3 of Egypt's northern governorates, Bahira, Kafr el-Sheikh, and Menufia. Egypt's irrigation ministry blamed the dam. It accused Ethiopia of reckless dam management and called the result a man-made flood. Egypt's Prime Minister Mustafa Madbouli said the government had expected the river to rise. Ethiopia answered that its releases had followed its own rules and that the dam had spared Sudan far worse flooding. It also said the flooded fields sat on land that people had settled inside the river's old floodplain. The first fight after the opening was about numbers nobody shares. There's no joint system reporting what the dam releases hour by hour, so neither side could prove its case. In November 2025, the Atlantic Council wrote that the gap itself feeds the mistrust. Ethiopia installed an Israeli air defense system called Spider at the dam over Egyptian objections. In March 2025, Israel's Foreign Minister Gideon Saar brought a group of weapons makers to Addis Ababa. In January 2024, Ethiopia had signed a port deal with Somaliland, a breakaway region of Somalia. Egypt's answer came that August, a defense pact with Somalia signed in Cairo on August 14th. 2 weeks later, about 1,000 Egyptian commandos had arrived in Somalia. Sudan's civil war split the river basin the same way, Egypt on one side, Ethiopia on the other. Egypt backs the Sudanese army of General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan. Ethiopia and the UAE back the rapid support forces of Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, the commander known as Hemedti. In November 2025, Masad Boulos, President Trump's senior advisor on African and Middle Eastern affairs, said the dispute must be resolved through technical means, not political pressure. In January 2026, President Trump wrote to El-Sisi and offered to mediate again. The letter said that no state in this region should unilaterally control the precious resources of the Nile and disadvantage its neighbors in the process. Egypt and Sudan both welcomed it. Ethiopia gave no formal reply to the offer of mediation. The dam just kept running. So the dam runs on behind its air defenses, and nobody downstream sees its numbers. The whole dispute now comes down to a number nobody has agreed on: how much water Ethiopia must let through in a dry year. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam runs all year, and hydropower doesn't use the water up. It spins the turbines and keeps going. Making power requires flow, so holding water back costs Ethiopia money. And when the lake is full, whatever comes in must go out. Ethiopia argues its lake actually saves water. Nigat, the lake behind the dam, loses about 1.5 billion cubic meters a year to evaporation. Lake Nasser, Egypt's reservoir in the desert, loses 7 to 10 times as much. Lake Nasser is what gets Egypt through droughts. It stores several years of water, and that stored water carried Egypt through the dry stretches of the early 1970s and the mid-1980s. A dry year doesn't hurt Egypt, but a run of dry years can. The dangerous sequence starts with a drought long enough to pull Lake Nasser down while Nigat drops too. Both can run low at the same time. Then the drought breaks, and the question arrives. Does Ethiopia send the recovery water downstream to refill Lake Nasser, or hold it back to restart its own turbines? If Nigat falls below 590 meters, the dam can't make power at all. That's the moment the two countries have never agreed on. Egypt wants the answer in writing: a guaranteed release of 39 billion cubic meters a year during a drought. Ethiopia points to about 35 and refuses to sign any fixed number. After a century of treaties and threats, the dispute comes down to 4 billion cubic meters in a bad year. No court can settle it. The two sides have never agreed on what officially counts as a drought, and they don't share live data on the river. And no court has the power to force an answer. A working deal would spell out definitions for dry years, release schedules for each one, rules for who refills first, open data, and a referee both sides accept. None of it exists yet. In March 2026, Ethiopia announced 3 more dams on the Blue Nile, each costing around $3.5 billion. 2 of them, Karadobi and Mendaya, come straight off the 1964 American report. The third, Beko Abo, wasn't on it. The engineers behind that report measured the river before anyone dammed it. 60 years later, their numbers still describe the water everyone is arguing over. And if the March announcement holds, 2 of their dams are coming off the shelf. Egypt's water still comes from a river it doesn't control, and that river now has an operator upstream. What Ethiopia owes the people downstream has never been written down.